About building better scouting systems using Castle, our scouting app / system, as an example. So there's a few things we're going to cover today. The first thing we're going to cover is who we are as a team and why we created Castle. After that, the next step is going to be to talk about how Castle works. So essentially how we created it from a technical standpoint and how scouts can best use this website to optimize scouting. Then finally, we're going to talk about how you yourself can create your own scouting system. So this is who we are. We are the Technics is a little
Part of the modern battlefield, where circuits spark and tools like steel, we are the Technics. Armed with innovation, driven by teamwork, and forged in fires of competition, we charge forward into the future of robotics.
Every little part of our robot is manufactured in-house, leaving team members with the technical and collaborative skills to pursue STEM in college and their future careers.
I feel like I've learned a lot of technical skills that I didn't think I really had hitherto.
We end up getting really good at delegating tasks, looking for things to do.
This past year, we founded our own FTC team, the Fight Knights, sharing our expertise, CAD design, and manufacturing resources. Beyond that, we've also mentored SLO teams like the Potatoes, helping them refine their presentations, programming, and strategy.
In the shop, we do our best to level the playing field for everyone going through robotics, which is why we maintain 50-50 gender balance in our team and have partnered with 6 Girl Scout troops to give lessons in Arduino and the principles of engineering. We help host an annual workshop at the Intrepid Museum of Science and Technology in New York City, reaching over 500 students and potentially inspiring them to enter STEM.
I've seen hundreds of videos of kids come in and out of the robotics lab, and it's a pleasure each time seeing them and seeing how much they learn. And so
Perseverance was some growth. Positivity, maybe, as silly as that sounds. Harmony, excellence, inspire.
So yeah, that's a little video about us. Now I'm going to discuss the scouting issues we identified in our existing scouting system. If you don't identify the issues in your existing scouting system, it's going to be virtually impossible to address them. So that's the first thing we did when attempting to optimize this scouting system. So the first issue we identified was that there was a pretty poor culture surrounding scouting. That included people pawning off scouting to rookies, people making jokes about not scouting, and this led to unreliable data and data that didn't have great quality. Another issue we encountered was we had a lot of disorganized data. Essentially, we would have scouting data across 3 main platforms. This included Google Spreadsheets, the Purple Warehouse, and Google Forms, each filling their own respective purpose. However, when you're crafting a pick list, it can be very difficult to sift through all that data and then make your pick. And that even goes for when you're at a line selection and a team you thought would be available to you wasn't. Obviously, you have a limited time based on the rule that was implemented last year, so having to sift through all this data is really unoptimal. A third issue we identified was that there was undefined leadership in the strategy department. We only had one executive, and that was for strategy. That meant if that strategy lead had to be in the match, in the pit, to help strategize for matches, maximize RPs, and try to win matches, you wouldn't really have anyone in the pits to help ensure everybody was scouting, which was a pretty big issue because it meant you could get some unreliable data and some data that didn't have the best quality. A fourth issue we saw using the Purple Warehouse or even Google Sheets was that there wasn't a really great way to rank teams efficiently. So if we wanted to see what the best barge robots were in that specific competition, which obviously would be a great fit for us because we couldn't do barge, we couldn't simply rank, okay, what teams have scored the barge the most in the most efficient manner, which is a pretty big issue. It really wasn't effective or efficient to continue doing so. A fifth issue we encountered is we collected a lot of trivial data about teams. We used Google Forms for pit scouting, but some of the questions we asked like how many coral do you cycle per match, those can be answered while just watching the data, and they're obviously going to be much more reliable because some teams tend to over-exaggerate their abilities. Another thing we asked is we would ask what type of motors you use, what's your drive base, etc. But that's not particularly relevant because if a team's scoring 8 coral a match in deep climbing, it doesn't matter if they're using Neos or Krakens, that's kind of irrelevant. And the sixth and final issue we encountered was that there was a lack of objective scouting. So what that meant is you would have a few scouts who had very strong voices and opinions on the team, and they would kind of push teams through based on just a few matches. Obviously that's not the best because you're going for consistency at least most of the time, and so having this kind of hurt us. These are the 6 solutions to the aforementioned issues. So in order to resolve the culture issue, we decided to implement a system where we gave public shout-outs to the best scouts. So for example, last year, one of our scouts, Armadine, he scouted 100 matches before even competition, just collecting as much data as possible, as much knowledge as possible for our strategy going into competition. So what did we do? Well, we publicly praised him in front of the entire team and applauded his tremendous work. And as a result, we saw that more people are willing to put time into scouting, work even harder. And that's obviously what we want. We want a culture that rewards scouting, not one that punishes people that don't scout. We found that's far more effective in getting people to do their assignments. And then, in order to resolve the issue of having data across the Purple Warehouse, Google Forms, and Google Sheets, we wanted to making sure that all the data was on one website. So we wanted to figure out some way, some solution, which I'll come back to later, that had everything in one website. That way, when a line selection comes, you're not sifting through 3 different platforms. Then, due to the undefined leadership we had, at least last year, we decided going into the off-season competition this year to implement a system where there would be 2 strategy leads, 1 for match strategy and 1 for scouting. We saw that that was incredibly helpful. That scouting lead made sure that everybody was getting their matches done and we had the best data possible, while the strategy lead was in the pit helping everybody, the strategy lead is the drive coach, helping make sure we were as prepared as possible for the upcoming match. Finally, another thing we wanted was we wanted to rank teams. That's kind of was a no-brainer. So we wanted to utilize some sort of scouting app/website where you could rank teams on pretty much every criteria possible. So if you look at this game, Reefscape, we wanted to be able to rank teams on deep climb percentage, odds on algae, even defense if necessary. So that was pretty much a must-have. That was one of the solutions we really wanted to have in our new scouting system. Then, regarding collecting trivial data, we had a strategy meeting between our scouts and the head of strategy and our drive team to determine what data we thought would be most important for all games. So we kind of censored out when we collected data such as dimensions of robot, etc. As long as you're legal, if we think you're a good fit for us, that's really all that matters. And the 6th and final solution is that we wanted to, again, limit biases and not objective data. So we decided to emphasize quantitative data. That was really the thing we wanted to have the most. So we used that much more, placed much more emphasis on objective data and quantifiable data than we previously did. So this led us to create Castle, our scouting website. We found that there wasn't really an existing viable website that would answer or have all of our solutions. And again, as aforementioned, we wanted to have a congregated solution. So we thought, because we have the time to do so, the best thing to possibly do was create our own website. Now I'm going to hand it off to my partner Jerry to talk about how we created Castle.
Thank you, Hadi, for your introduction. I'd like to introduce our draft that we created during the 2024 crescendo season. So there's 3 main features that we kept for moving towards Reefscape. The first thing was adding scouting data, because scouters that needed to be able to add quantitative data, so we had 2 main scoring mechanisms, scouter and speaker and amp. Then we wanted to have a way where we can draw the auton path, so where we can see where the robot went during its autonomous period. Now, other trivial data like competition, we really didn't emphasize and we didn't really care. But mainly the end game where we selected if they park, climb, or they didn't do it. Now the shots missed and total shots, those were not included in the final design. Now moving on to our team page, we wanted a page where we can manage all our scouters in one place so we can assign them assignments to do their scouting. Now finally, we have our compared data page where we can compare two teams by basically quantitative data, and we can compare the all-time paths simultaneously. So here we started with 4 core libraries, the Blue Alliance, I'll get to in a moment, Python and Flask. But now Python and Flask is a library built upon Python, which allows us to organize our files in a structured manner that basically makes our lives easier, because there's 2 folders named template and static. Template is where you put all your HTML and you can render that in Python. And then your static is going to be your JSON and your style sheets. Now SQLite is basically our starting database where we can store data locally. Now, before we get to Blue Alliance, I want to talk about how the API works. So the user presses like a button, and they wanted a callback from the server. Now Python is going to send a request, which basically with certain headers like the API key or certain keys like what year it is or what FRC they want. Now the API is going to access that information and return that information to Flask, where the Python Flask app will format it in a way that humans can read. So an example of this is this endpoint from the Blue Alliance. So this endpoint basically tells us what events did this team go to during a certain year. Now it takes 2 parameters, team key and year. So those are the 2 that you need to fill out. Then when you send a request, you receive back in JSON. Basically JSON is a way that you can organize data. So everything behind that colon right there is a key, and everything after the colon is a value. Now if you wanted to access that value, you would do, let's say, a variable called data that represents this JSON file. Then you do data, square brackets, and the city. Then that will return Brooklyn. So how does this integrate with everything in our app? So our Python Flask is going to be our main core part of this thing. And then basically our Blue Alliance is going to provide us real-time data of the regional, and our Python Flask is going to render that into let the user see the interface. And our database, SQLite, is going to be handling the adding scouting data and removing scouting data and editing. Now we also later switched to MongoDB because it was more convenient and we can access the data more efficiently. So what this example of a Blue Alliance integration we had is our match schedule. So this page essentially tells you input a team number, then they show you the latest event that the team went to and its standing currently. So in NYC role replay, we were 12, 8, and 8, and our most recent match that we lost 137 to 153. Now we can also, when we add data, we can also use the Blue Alliance API to make our lives easier. So you can select the regional, then you select the qual, and then we can fetch the teams in that certain qual match. So I'm gonna hand it back to Hadi.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the user interface for the scouts, how to best use Castle. One of, I would say, the most unique things about Castle is the ability to input data about all-time paths. So over here you can see there's a variety of tools you can use. I'm not going to go into detail right now, you can use them on your own time, but I'm just going to say why this is important. Obviously compatibility is super important when you're making alliances. For example, last year we had a one-piece L4 Auton. So if another team had that and besides that they could only do a taxi from either side, that would mean if we picked them, we would be leaving at least 7 points on the table every single match, which is definitely not what you want to do in those high-stake competitive matches. So in doing so, we'll show later how you can, another aspect of comparing Auton paths, but by collecting this data, you ensure that the team you're being paired with is going to be as compatible as possible. This is how we inputted data. So this is just the Auton tab. Obviously you have the teleop tab, but it looks essentially the same. There's two distinct ways you can input data. You can either click the plus or minus tab until you get to the number you want, or you can simply tap on the number and manually input it. So let's say a team scored 3 L4s in Auton, you would click the plus button 3 times, or you would simply click on the number and input 3. Another aspect, you also have the end games. This is pretty different from the Auton and Teleop periods of the match. And here we have a pretty important part of our presentation, of our scouting website, is the fact that there's a drop down to see what climb teams attempted. So you can click park, shallow climb, deep climb, but you can also click whether or not the team's climbing was successful. And you'll see later when you have the leaderboard and you look at the history of teams, you can see their deep climb percentage or their climb percentage. That way you have much more detailed information about how many times the team is successfully attempting deep climb. Again, you can also rate teams, so that includes the defense rating. So if you ever want to pick a team for their defense, you think you won't get into the point in playoffs that you want without that defense, you can rate teams and then later in the leaderboard section rank them based off defense to select the best player. Then we have other stats. This includes the robot disabled status. So you'll see later how that is portrayed in the leaderboard or match history tab. But there's 4 options you can click. If the robot was disabled, if the robot was disabled for part of the match, most of the match, or the entirety of its match. And if you can see on the next slide that 1880 for call 42, the reason they're highlighted yellow is because they were disabled for that match. That way we have a tangible way of measuring whether teams were consistent or not. In this case, we know, at least for this portion of the event, 1880 was struggling. So that could, again, emerge in playoff matches. Another aspect of the match history tab is you can see any outliers by teams. So you can see on a match-to-match basis how they're doing. That way you can more or less see their ceiling and their floor, which is pretty important. You're not only basing everything off averages, because with averages, one bad match or one great match can really shift or have massive influence on those numbers. And you want to make sure you're getting the whole story. Another aspect of Castle is the lighthouse or compare page. So if you're stuck between 2 or 3 teams and you're not particularly sure on how to rank those teams, you can utilize the compare feature. So if you look at the next tab, for example, next slide, this is a zoomed in version. You can see that if you were prioritizing barge scoring in your criteria, in your alliance criteria, you would say that team 3360 was the best for you. They're scoring by far the most algae in the barge. If perchance you wanted a robot that could score a lot more coral because you're an algae bot, then 3173 igniters would be the robot you wanted to pick. And you can measure them off any criteria. If you look at the last slide, you can measure them on deep climb percentage, etc. Now, I'm finally going back to what I was talking about earlier with comparing Auton paths. We'll discuss this more later, but you can also use the Lighthouse page to view the paths of teams for every single match and their notes. So in doing so, you can see what Autons these teams are running the most, again, to ensure compatibility during playoffs. You can also compare notes, so if the scouts had more detailed information on one team or just their opinions on how the match went, you can use this to help craft your pick list. Now I'm going to pass it off to Jerry to continue explaining the compare page.
So this is another feature that we created for our Lighthouse page. So this essentially what this is basically we have 4 stats: auto scoring, teleop scoring, climb success, and defense rating. Now what this essentially does is basically for the teleop and auto scoring, we basically take the amount of points for each level and how much they scored in algae. So like a net is like 4 points. So we take that and count, and then we take the average of those values. Then we normalize the value, so make this value smaller to a way you can see more clearly. As you can see, igniters and X-Cats, they're really good at scoring teleo and auto scoring. But as you can see, some teams are a little better at rating defense. So what this means is that you can rank teams based on their abilities to make an adequate pick list. Now, going over our team page, this page is basically our page that we assign tasks and give scouting tasks to scouters. So what we have is we have a join code. So each join code is going to be different for every single team. So once you make a code, you tell your scouters to join this team. Now, we have 3 members here. We have owner, admin, and moderator. We have the same roles: owner, admin, member. Now, what this essentially means is that the owner just owns it. The admins are the ones that are assigning tasks to rookies or like veterans. Now, here we have like a task here. It tells us tells admin to scout TVR qual 4 of team 20, and that's due at December 2nd, 5:10 p.m. Now, when that scout finishes this match and it's finished scouting, it can come to this page and you can press that drop down and says, "Oh, I completed the match," in order to let the match strategy lead that I've completed the match. Now here we have a leaderboard, what Hadi was referring to earlier, that we can rank teams based on deep climb. So as you can see, 694 and 1796, they're at the top for most coral. But if you look at 694, they have 100% deep climb compared to every other team. Now there's also other stats like how much they score on auto. So a 694 might score 2.7 coral per auto. Now here is another way if you don't want to read the mind-boggling data of tables. So here's a match view where you can view basically the three six teams that are playing currently. So as you can see, 191 and Team 20, they both decline. And for that, in the bottom, they have totals. So basically what that total is basically how much they scored, including auto and teleo. Now here is comparing auto paths. So as you can see, there's 3 auto paths currently, and as you see, igniters, they're gonna cycle from the left back and forth, while Team Rice might just stand there. Now, we've also encountered many issues in making Castle. So what's an issue that we encountered that was detrimental to our regional success was probably MongoDB has like a limit to how much connections you could have at a certain time. Because a connection is basically like you have like a stale connection between the server and you. And the more connections you have, the more RAM the server has to allocate to you. But at a certain point, once you reach a certain amount of RAM that the server cannot allocate to you anymore, the app will crash. So moving into New York City, we reduced the amount of connections to basically 22 connections, which basically allowed our app to function perfectly without any issues.
Anyway, next I'm going to talk about what scouting systems best fit with Castle or really anything else, because it's not just about what app or platform you're using to collect your data. It also matters how your scouts are being organized to collect that data. If they're disorganized, you're not going to get the most out of every single match. If you don't get the most out of every single match, you're going to be at a significant disadvantage during matches or during when it's time for alliance selection and you have to finalize your pick list. So one such system, and this is pretty popular across the FRC community, is the shift system. So essentially what this is, you have 6 scouts, and one scout scouts red 1, another red 2, red 3, blue 1, blue 2, blue 3, and they would scout every single team for, let's say, in that thing for the next 10 matches, and then you have another shift of 6 scouts to come back on and scout the next 10 matches. So there's 2 pretty distinct pros to implementing this scouting system. One such pro is it's very easy to implement. You can do this pretty much almost before competition starts, and all you have to do is assign one scout, each scout, which one they're supposed to do, and you go down that list, and you're done. So it's very efficient for the strategy lead to organize. A second pro is that it's pretty easy to implement and execute. It's pretty easy to do for teams that don't have a lot of scouts. So if you have a limited number of scouts, you have 6 scouts, let's say, that's all you need to scout the entire competition. So even though it is going to be demanding on your scouts, you'll be able to collect all that data in order to have the best pick list possible. Again, there's a couple cons to this. One such con is it can be pretty tedious for the scouts to scout all those matches, right? Because if, again, like that one scout could scout 20, 30 matches, and it's very menial, you don't really have any investment or knowledge in the teams you're scouting because you're scouting so many, upwards of 20 possibly, and that's not really great. This also brings me to my next point. Another disadvantage of using the system is the scouts won't have a great knowledge of each team in the event. This occurs because, again, each team and how they perform is getting lost in the chaos of competition and the chaos of the amount of matches they're scouting. And that's kind of an issue because when you're crafting a pick list and you have questions about which teams you want to be on your pick list, you can't ask the scouts what their personal opinions were unless they did outside research on different teams, because they just don't know enough to help contribute to making the best pick list possible. So this brings me to another possible system. This is called the expert system. So this is what our team implemented for NYC Robo Replay, an off-season competition in October. Essentially what this is each scout's assigned to scout all the matches of 2 to 3 teams. We found that this was pretty beneficial because it meant each scout's getting a lot of knowledge about the teams they're scouting for. That means they can play impactful roles in match strategy, in alliance selection, and that's super beneficial because you get to have that opinion, that second opinion, that's also matched with the objective data. As I discussed earlier, you want to limit personal biases, but you also want to make sure while you're emphasizing quantitative data, you're also combining that with personal experiences and opinions to make sure you're getting the entire picture, and that's depicted as accurately as possible. However, there's some pretty distinct cons as well to this system. One such con is it's very difficult to implement, because, especially with a small amount of scouts. This is the case because, well, if you have a small number of scouts, you're going to have one scout that has to scout 5, 6 teams, and that's hard to do, to scout every single match of 5 to 6 teams. You're going to have to really be on top of the match schedule, and we obviously know competition's incredibly chaotic, so it can be a bit difficult at times to make sure you're getting in the stands and scouting the teams you're supposed to for every single match. Another issue we saw was if the teams you're an expert of are playing at the same time, you obviously can't scout them at the same time. And even though Blue Alliance is pretty good at uploading videos of past matches on it, sometimes that's not the case, and you will have to wait 2, maybe even 3 hours to access that footage. That's an issue, especially if you're on day 2 of quals, right before a line selection. If you really need that piece of data, that data point, you're just not going to have it, and that's definitely something you want to keep in mind. That's why something our team did is we doubled down. We had multiple people like, when necessary, we had multiple teams, multiple scouts cover the same teams, and that helped us a lot, making sure we get all the data we wanted. So now we're going to discuss whether or not you need your own scouting website, and then the steps to do after coming to this conclusion. So this is a decision that should be made on a team-to-team basis. One size and one solution is just not going to fit all, because there's so many other scouting resources out there, and each team has its own unique flaws in their scouting systems. So if most/all of your existing problems can be solved using another scouting system that already exists, whether that's Viper, Purple Warehouse, or even Castle, you might as well use those. There's no real need to reinvent the wheel if you can get everything you want in something that already exists. However, if that's not the case, and you have the time and the knowledge to do so, we highly encourage to do so, because it can't hurt to have a customized website for your team. You gotta customize it as much as possible, and that's very helpful because the data you want to input, you can make sure that it's there. So during competition, let's say you have a week 2 competition, after you finish that and you decided, okay, we want another data point, you can add that data point seamlessly. You don't have to completely switch the entire scouting website you're using because you want that one data point. Another thing you should do, if you're not really sure you want to completely start with your own scouting website, is you can innovate upon existing scouting websites. Most websites out there are open source, so you can look at the code, look at their GitHub, and based off that, create your own scouting website that has a few tweaks and modifications, and that can also be incredibly helpful. Now we're going to discuss the steps of creating this app. So you're essentially doing the engineering design process. We're just going to go in depth on each step that's pretty much specific to creating a website. So the first step is you're going to want to identify systemic issues within your scouting system. Again, if you don't know the issues on your team, you can't properly analyze them, and you can't properly fix them. They're just going to continue existing. The second thing you want to do, this is kind of part of step 1, is you're going to want to start brainstorming solutions. Just start throwing things out there and see what sticks, and eventually, after iteration, you'll land at the most efficient solution. So this leads into step number 2. You want to determine if and how those solutions can be integrated into an app. As you saw, some issues in our scouting system was issues with culture, and that can't really be fixed with a scouting app. So that's something you're going to want to keep in your own mind, and that's just something you'll have to do in your own team, promote scouting, and try to fix that flaw. The third step is to begin constructing the programming logic. As Jerry showed you, you can use Excalidraw to create the programming logic for your website. That way you have a starting point to move off of. Once you move off of that starting point, you can create pretty much a beta version of your scouting website. So Jerry programmed his in Python using Crescendo. So that just pretty much provides a template for the logic and what you want to implement into that scouting website. That way, when the season starts, you'll be able to seamlessly integrate it without taking time away from working on the robot. The fourth step is you want to identify one of the previous scouting systems I mentioned to implement to use alongside your scouting website. It does nobody any good if you're using a system or a way to organize your scouts that's not really compatible with your scouting website or your scouting department in general. That's just going to impede your progress and ability to craft the best pick list possible. Finally, step 5. Jerry mentioned this a little bit, but another thing, what you're going to want to do is place as much testing on your website as possible, and it should be stress testing. Going into Tech Valley, we tried to test, but we didn't really do a great job of maximizing the stress placed upon the website. So at competition, at Tech Valley, the website didn't function as intended. That's obviously disastrous because you're going to want to use that data. At Tech Valley, we weren't really in a picking position, so it didn't really matter all that much. However, it's obviously always good to have this data because in matches, you want to know what other teams are doing, and you didn't really have access to that. That's why one of the things I want to encourage the most is placing as much testing as possible on your scouting website. Just opening laptops, running your website in the worst possible conditions, please do so. As we all know, at competition, you don't have an Ethernet cable, you're not going to be in the best Wi-Fi possible. You're in a stadium that probably doesn't have great cell service. So if your website's not as stress tested as possible, it's just not going to work, and you're not going to have access to that data at a critical point of the competition leading into alliance selection. Then finally, your goal or your finished product is going to be the website, but you're not limited to just having that website done. You're going to want to communicate results. This can be on a Chief Delphi post, this can be on social media. Our team, for example, we actually made 2 separate Chief Delphi posts. One just announcing Castle and our results and the ways to use it, but also on our open alliance. That way, anyone who's watching that could look at Castle and see, okay, this is yet another resource for scouting. And this kind of brings me into my next point, because it's never a bad thing for people to have more resources out there for the FRC community. Because who knows, maybe the solutions your teams are encountering are similar to another team's. That way, when you provide this other resource, they'll have access to it and be able to continue moving forward with this tool. This is going to be a model, pretty much an example of our timeline and the step-by-step process we conducted. So in October of 2024, we began identifying our flaws and also brainstorming in the later months, November and December. The reason we did so in the preseason, not during build season, I think is pretty obvious. During build season, your main goal is to construct your robot as quickly as possible, and you can't really do that if a lot of your attention is focused towards a scouting website, which obviously is important, but at the end of the day, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of other scouting resources out there. So if you don't have a solution by build season, it may not be the best idea to invest a lot of time and resources into a tool that already exists in FRC. So leading into January 2025, obviously there's going to be a few adjustments you have to make. You obviously don't know the game, so you can't say how many, like you can't include stuff about coral and algae and deep climb. So, but because you already have the template laid out in the preseason in November, October, December, whatever, you'll be able to pretty seamlessly integrate all the data and names that you want into your scouting website. After that, was kind of a flaw. We tested in February and March, which isn't a terrible thing, but again, you're going to want to stress test it as much as possible before the season. That, if you saw, like Tech Valley was kind of a test for Castle, and that way in New York City Regional, we were adequately prepared for competition, and Castle actually performed incredibly well. At New York City Robo Replay, which was this October, again, Castle performed right up to par with our expectations of it, and we had really no issues with it. So again, that happened because we stress tested on Castle and emphasized making sure it's going to work under really bad conditions. Then in March 2025, we began advertising on Chief Delphi. I kind of discussed this earlier, but you're going to want to communicate results. You're going to want to advertise it as a resource. Not only do we make our own posts, but on Chief Delphi threads about the strategy resources of Reefscape, we message these people to say, hey, Castle's another great resource. We would greatly appreciate it if you advertise it on your platform, on your post, and they did so. And we actually found that teams across the globe used it. One team in California that completed at Silicon Valley, I think, they played great and were actually finalists as first pick, I believe, which just shows that Castle can be used at a very, very high level. Obviously, Silicon Valley is famous for its high level of competition at a regional level. So I believe that does it for today. So does anybody have any questions before? Yeah.
What did you code the front end?
I code the front end in HTML, Tailwind, and CSS, JavaScript.
So no framework.
No frameworks.
Thank you. Anyone else have any questions? Okay. Well, I think that's about it for, yeah.
How many members do you think it's like important to delegate to a scout?
Sorry,
How many members do you think should be on a scout?
well, for the shift method, all you would need is 6 scouts. But in my opinion, anybody who isn't actively a part of the pit team or drive team should be scouting. There's no reason they shouldn't be there, shouldn't be helping out the team in some manner. With more scouts, you're going to reduce burnout, which is obviously a good thing. You don't want to place a ton of stress on your scouts at such a stressful time in the robotics season. So if, let's say I have a few, so yeah, that's pretty much my answer. Anybody who's not pit crew or drive team, at least in our team, help scout. Thank you. Anybody else? Or, okay. Well, thank you so much for coming out, guys. It's very much appreciated.